Arsenal head coach Mikel once said that in a game against Manchester City, his team used 43 different structures during the game. Some thought this was a ridiculous statement to mock journalists, others thought it real insight into Arteta's tactics. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Regardless, I think it highlighted the genuine gap between the typical understanding of a team's formation and what's actually happening out on the football pitch. After all, in broadcasts and apps and even video games, we're given graphics of these static formations all the time, and we end up associating a team or a manager with a formation, despite the fact it might be really inaccurate. I've said before that 4-3-3 is almost never 4-3-3. A good example of that is a team I've been watching a fair amount recently, and that's Girona from the Spanish La Liga. Because Girona, across different phases of the game, makes some pretty radical structural changes that are quite uncommon. So much so that it can be pretty confusing as to what's actually going on. So my question is, why have football formations gotten so weird? Why is Arteta talking about 43 different structures? Well, it turns out when you start to look at it, the answer is pretty interesting, because it's got a lot to do with the specific type of football that Girona and Arsenal and a lot of modern teams want to play. So let's look at Girona. If you didn't know, Girona are part of the City Group, meaning they have the same owners as Manchester City, and under coach Michel, they do share some footballing characteristics with Guardiola's team. The obvious metrics are of course in possession, and in terms of build-up, both teams are the most patient in their respective leagues for getting the ball from back to front, and both also have a very few number of direct attacks. But more than these general metrics, what these teams share is the same underlying philosophy. That being, of course, what Guardiola calls the positional attack. And one of the key details of this philosophy is this.
Everybody has to be in the position. When you move much, it's not good. The ball comes where we are. We don't go where to pick up the ball. It's completely different.
So we don't go to the ball goes to where we are. And that simple idea is kind of the reason that you need so many different structures in possession. Why is that? Well, let's first look at a team that doesn't use this philosophy. I recently made a video on Real Madrid and talked about how in possession, their players have a lot of positional freedom to progress the ball. For example, in build-up, if they're being pressed, their midfielders can take initiative to drop towards the ball and create a numerical advantage. The same applies further forward, where players might, for example, cross the pitch and arrive unmarked in support. So in a way, it's the unpredictable movement of the players that creates the spaces to exploit. However, in a team where you don't move to the ball, this unpredictable movement sort of doesn't happen. Players wait in their predefined zones, waiting for the ball to arrive to them. So you might be thinking, how do they ever create space and progress? And that's where the formation or the structure comes into play. Because in the positional attack, the structure itself has to accomplish a lot of the things that would otherwise be accomplished by player initiative. Two very simple examples just to illustrate that. One is a team building up with 3 centre-backs in order to have the numerical advantage against 2 centre-forwards. Because 3 is bigger than 2, your wide centre-backs automatically have space to carry the ball forward. The second example is using a line of 5 players in attack against a 4-man backline. Often you'll see the player in the half space dragging a fullback, so you can isolate your wide player in space. In both examples, it's the structure itself and not any individual decision by a player which has created space. And of course, it's all based upon how your opponent is going to defend. That's why in the modern game we see so many of these tactical chess matches, where managers try to find the right shape to exploit the opponent's defensive tactics. And if they get that shape wrong, there's very little the players can do about it, especially if you don't have top quality. Which brings me back to Girona, because they're the perfect example of a team using a pretty unorthodox structure to solve a specific footballing problem. If you look at a Girona team graphic, you're almost certain to see some sort of 4-3-3, but when the game starts, it looks something more like this, a structure that I'm going to call a 3-1-6. Which might seem pretty weird, but actually isn't completely unique. In fact, Erik ten Hag uses this a lot at Manchester United, and Julian Nagelsmann also used it a few times at Bayern. But recently, Girona have used it to great effect, especially when they've come up against low blocks. Low blocks are often the bane of possession teams, but by using this hyper-offensive structure, Girona have actually been able to dismantle them fairly comfortably. And an amazing example of this was their game against Mallorca. Now, usually in order to create this 3-1-6 shape, Girona used the left back, Miguel Gutierrez, to push up into the half space and effectively become a third attacking midfielder. But in this game against Mallorca, they didn't bother with that. They just pushed up their right back, Jan Couto, to become a winger. So you get this 3-1-6 shape versus Mallorca's deep 5-4-1. And as it turns out, 3-1-6 is very good against 5-4-1. The problem for Mallorca was that they couldn't really apply pressure to Girona's deep playmakers. You can see in this system, Girona have essentially 3 number 10s. In this game, it's Yangel Herrera, Ivan Martin, and Victor Sigankov. And the presence of these players between the lines waiting for the ball and not moving towards it means that if the midfielder steps up to press, the centre-backs are actually outnumbered. So instead of pressing, Mallorca elect to stay in shape and block the passing lanes. That leaves Alex Garcia, Girona's pivot, with complete freedom to either 1, try and find any of those number 10s in the pockets, or more importantly 2, shift the ball easily from right to left. Because the other benefit of having all these 10s is that you force Girona's 4-man midfield to be very narrow, again blocking the passing lanes. So when you shift it from right to left, the left centre-back, who was Blind, also has a lot of time and space. If Mallorca want to prevent that, then the right midfielder must step out and close down the ball. But that represents yet another problem, because if he does that, it will isolate Girona's left winger, Savio, 1v1 with the fullback. Now, usually the third centre-back would be able to step out and help, but because of those 3 10s, that would be really risky. There's just space there to exploit. So what ended up happening was that Savio did get his 1v1s pretty often, and he absolutely took advantage of that. And that same pattern happened multiple times throughout a single half. Girona pinned Mallorca's midfield on the right, used their free playmakers to shift it to the left, and then found different ways to exploit that space, whether it's through the centre forward or going back across into where the 10s are, and some variation of this right to left sequence led to 3 out of 4 of Girona's first half goals. So that's a glimpse of how, just by getting the structure of the team right, Girona's coach Michel gave his team a significant advantage against the opponent's defensive system. If Mallorca weren't playing 5-4-1, if they were playing something else, then maybe 3-1-6 might not have worked so well. In fact, Girona have struggled a couple of times this season when teams have been more aggressive, because you're very reliant on your defenders to progress the ball through the lines into where those forward players are waiting. And so hopefully with that, you can see the reason for the sort of confusing nature of modern formations. Coaches, specifically those who follow the positional attack, need unique structures to deal with unique defensive setups due to the very nature of the way that philosophy works. It's why Guardiola changes his formation every 5 minutes. But as powerful a tool as that can be, it also creates a huge responsibility for the head coaches who operate this way. Because if you put players into a structure and that ends up not working, it's really difficult for the players themselves to do anything about it. And that creates an interesting question for clubs who hire these kind of managers. You have to be very confident in their tactical ability, not only to set up their team one way, but actually be able to adapt and create new systems over time. If you have Pep Guardiola, then obviously you've got no problem. But if not, maybe it's worth considering going down a different road, one that gives the players themselves a little bit more room to problem solve regardless of that formation. So kind of a different video today, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I just want to thank you guys so much for the support recently. I've been getting a lot of love on the content, and not only does it mean so much to me, but every like, comment, etc. helps me to keep doing this, which is an immense joy. So thanks again, and I hope to see you back for the next one. Take care.